They tell you that war is chaos. But chaos, I learned to manage. Chaos has rules. The rule of caliber, the rule of trajectory, the rule of attrition. You input the data, you calculate the arc, and steel lands where it's supposed to land. I was good at the math. I lived by the math. The real war begins when you realize the enemy isn't interested in victory the way we define it. They're just trying to survive the sheer volume of steel you're throwing at them. And the real terror? That begins when the volume you rely on, the industrial output of Detroit, the clean lines of our logistics, the flawless execution preached by command, turns against you. Sicily, July 1943. We were barely 5 days in, hunkered down near Gela. The sun had fled, leaving behind a humid, chemical stench of disturbed earth and spent cordite. I was Sergeant Thomas Vance, forward observer attached to the divisional artillery, currently wrestling with an SCR-300 radio set that seemed determined to chew through its batteries faster than I could change them. I kept running the numbers in my head. Tens of thousands of men landed. Hundreds of ships. The overwhelming force doctrine was working. We were unstoppable. That was the propaganda we swallowed with our K rations. My job, however, was to deal with the minute detail, the coordinates that separated an effective barrage from a friendly casualty. Precision was my god. The silence tonight was the worst kind, a heavy, artificial vacuum broken only by the hiss of the radio static. It wasn't the silence of peace, but the quiet of exhausted men waiting for the next catastrophe. Everything felt stretched thin. Sleep was a hallucination, my eyes burned, and the taste in my mouth was metallic, like licking a dead battery. The tactical situation was simple. We'd secured the beachhead, but we were still vulnerable to counterattack, especially from the air. We were depending on the second wave of paratroopers and supplies coming in tonight. Every command post had been screaming for more flak defenses, more radar, better communication with the Navy, who were notoriously trigger-happy. "Vance, you got anything clear on the 101st drop zone?" Lieutenant Callahan's voice was a low rasp from the foxhole next to mine. He sounded like he was trying to hold a conversation through a mouthful of sand. I adjusted the squelch knob, wincing at the crackle. "Nothing solid, Lieutenant. Weather reports are clean. Moon is thin. Conditions are optimal for the jump, but the frequency is a mess. Too much interference. Or maybe just too many people trying to talk at once." I felt the familiar, cold pit in my stomach that wasn't exhaustion, but professional dread. We had so much equipment, so much industrial might, yet every command was filtered through tired men and faulty signal relays. We had built the largest, most sophisticated war machine in history, and now we were fighting a war where the greatest variables were fatigue and static. The irony was suffocating. We were drowning the Germans in resources, but we couldn't even keep a clean radio channel between battalions. I pulled out my log book, a worn ledger where I meticulously tracked every shell fired, every coordinate requested, every communications failure. It was my confession booth and my library. I looked down at the entry from 0300 hours. Requests for IFF codes remain vague. Lack of standardized protocol between Army A and Navy screening vessels creates high-risk environment. That risk environment was about to become acutely lethal. The air was thick and syrupy, the humidity making the sweat stick to my wool uniform. We were positioned near a cluster of M2 anti-aircraft guns, the formidable 90mm cannons, their crews looking like gaunt ghosts huddled around their machinery, their faces reflecting the nervous energy common before a big push. Callahan crawled over, clutching a thermos of lukewarm coffee. "Command says the first wave of C-47s should be hitting the perimeter in 20 minutes. Tell me those flyboys remembered to send the updated codes. I've been trying to confirm those codes since sundown," I admitted, taking a grateful gulp of the bitter sludge. "Navy says they're using ACK, Army says BDG. Air Force says they're relying on visual recognition and designated corridors. It's a goddamn symphony of conflicting orders, Lieutenant. This wasn't unusual, but tonight, the confusion felt amplified by the sheer terror we experienced days earlier. The Germans, even outnumbered and outgunned, had executed small, frustrating counterattacks, often relying on lone bombers sneaking through the haze. The American flak crews were jumpy. They hadn't slept properly in days. Every radar signature, every distant thrum, was instinctively translated into a hostile threat. I looked up at the sky. A clear night, mercifully free of heavy cloud cover. Perfect for dropping troops, perfect for seeing. But seeing wasn't the problem. The problem was identifying. The anti-aircraft gun commander, a wiry captain named O'Malley, who hadn't blinked in 3 hours, paced behind his battery. I watched him, noting the tightness around his jaw. O'Malley ran a professional outfit, precise and meticulous, just like me. But professionalism bends under exhaustion and fear. "We heard they had a mess the other night," O'Malley said, not looking at me, but staring at the dark horizon. "Some destroyers fired on a patrol boat. Thought it was E-boat." "Things happen in the dark, Captain," I offered weakly. "No, Sergeant." O'Malley fixed me with a gaze that looked far older than his years. "Things happen when you tell a man he has 10 seconds to decide if the dot on the screen is going to kill him or if it's bringing him cigarettes. And you don't give him a sure way to tell the difference." He was echoing my core fear. The American military machine preached efficiency and standardization, but at the tactical sharp end, under extreme stress, it devolved into individual, terrified judgment calls. And tonight, hundreds of paratroopers were relying on those terrified judgments. The distant, low hum began. It was a familiar, droning sound, the sound of multiple piston engines lumbering across the Mediterranean. It sounded like home. "They're coming," I whispered, checking the connection to the Divisional Fire Control Center one last time. The radio crackled back with a nervous voice. "All batteries, remain alert. We have unidentified signatures approaching fast. Possible nuisance raid." A nuisance raid. A few German planes trying to draw fire. A classic tactic. But O'Malley's men were keyed up for the transport stream, not a nuisance raid. I grabbed the mic. "This is FO Vance. Confirming those signatures are consistent with C-47s carrying the 82nd Airborne, possibly with fighter escort. Please verify." Silence. Then an anxious, high-pitched voice from the other end. "Negative, Vance. Radar confirms bogies. Fast movers, low altitude. Be advised, we may have German night fighters mixing in with the incoming transports." The tactical panic was instantly contagious. It happened in a cascading chain of error, speed, and noise. First, the distant roar of cannon fire, the Navy, anchored offshore, opening up first. Their shells, likely 5-inchers, whistled over us, aimed at some unseen target in the dark. The vibration of the nearby 90 mm stirred the damp air. Then, the German planes, small, fast shadows that skimmed the waves, dropping flare clusters, and a few token bombs far up the coast. The flares illuminated the sky not with light, but with an awful, sickly yellow glow that distorted all shapes. O'Malley's battery fired a few tentative bursts at the retreating German shadows. The explosions were sharp, percussive jolts that reset the rhythm of the night. And then, the bulk of the transports arrived. A long, beautiful, perfectly lined up stream of C-47s, their navigation lights blinking faintly. They were slow, heavy, and vulnerable, like massive, pregnant geese flying into a storm. The air control officer's voice screamed into my headphones, overridden by static. "Transports! Transports! Cease fire! I say, cease F!" The rest was lost in a catastrophic eruption of sound. Someone somewhere panicked. A small caliber battery, likely a 40mm Bofors, opened up first, its fire a frantic, rhythmic drumming. That sound was the trigger. Captain O'Malley, convinced by the earlier radar report and the surrounding chaos, shouted a desperate order. "Fire! Fire at will! They're diving!" The 90 MMS erupted next to me. The blast was physical, a punch to the chest that stole my breath. I felt the hot spent brass casings rain down on my helmet. The smell of powder and superheated metal was immediate and visceral. I stared, horrified, at the sky. It wasn't just one battery firing. It was dozens. The entire perimeter, the beaches, the Navy's ships, all of them, 1,000 guns, were throwing up a solid curtain of fiery tracers and high-explosive shells. It was the full, coordinated might of the American defenses, aimed straight at the incoming American transports. The sheer volume of fire was obscene. It was relentless. The sky, momentarily illuminated by the flares, showed the clear silhouettes of the C-47s being stitched by tracer fire. I grabbed the radio mic, screaming into the dead air. "Cease fire! Cease fire! For God's sake, they're ours! They're the 82nd!" My voice was a useless whisper against the thunder. One C-47, slightly ahead of the formation, burst into a magnificent, horrible fireball. It didn't just crash. It disintegrated in the air, 1,000 gallons of fuel igniting instantly. A terrifying arc of flame and wreckage plummeted into the sea, followed by a second plane, then a third. The pilots tried desperately to scatter, breaking formation, but they were flying into an inescapable wall of steel. The noise was maddening, the continuous roar of artillery overlaid with the desperate, choked cries and shouted orders coming through my radio. "We're hit! We're losing control! Requesting identification! I repeat, requesting identification!" Then, silence from that frequency. Just the static, roaring like a waterfall of death. I watched, numb, as the slaughter continued for what felt like an hour, though it was perhaps 7 minutes of pure, institutional failure. Some transports managed to turn back, damaged but alive. Others continued, trying to drop their loads, only to be torn apart before the paratroopers could even attempt to jump. When the last plane either crashed or fled, the American guns fell silent, one by one. The night was suddenly, profoundly quiet, save for the crackling static and the distant cries of men in the water. The air was heavy with the smell of sulfur and smoke. It was the scent of total, systemic defeat. The dawn arrived, not as a cleansing light, but as a cruel spotlight. The beach and the shallow waters were littered with wreckage. Shards of aluminum, twisted parachute silk, and the dark, wet shapes of bodies. The American Navy, having realized the horror they participated in, was sending out small boats, their crews looking sick and bewildered. I walked the perimeter, my legs moving mechanically. I needed to document the scene, log the coordinates, quantify the disaster. I was a man of numbers, and I needed to count the cost of our collective panic. The official tally, later quietly issued, would state 23 C-47s destroyed and 37 damaged. Over 300 men, paratroopers, flight crews, killed or wounded by their own side. I found a piece of fabric tangled in a clump of dry grass near one of the destroyed 90mm mounts. It was an American flag patch, torn from a uniform sleeve, stained dark with oil and blood. I picked it up, feeling the cheap, heavy quality of the embroidery. O'Malley was standing next to his gun, his face the color of wet ash. He was mechanically supervising his men cleaning the breach. "Vance," he said, his voice flat, "did you hear anything? Any confirmation that there were Germans mixed in?" I looked him straight in the eye, my own exhaustion replaced by a cold clarity. No, Captain. The Germans flew off after they dropped their flares. We shot down American-supplied planes because we were terrified of shadows, and because the system failed to give us a proper identification code." O'Malley simply nodded, processing the fact that his professional precision had been weaponized against his own people. He looked like a man who had committed the unforgivable sin of doing exactly what he was trained to do, under the most flawed command structure imaginable. The cleanup was swift and brutal. The priority was maintaining morale and keeping the incident out of enemy intelligence. The official narrative was already being forged. Heavy enemy resistance and successful German night fighter action resulted in significant losses to incoming transports. It was a lie. A calculated, necessary lie, according to the major who pulled me aside later that afternoon. "Vance, you're an FO. You know the importance of unit cohesion. This was the fog of war. Inevitable. We mourn the lost, but we move on. You saw nothing that needs documenting beyond the official report, understood? Sir, the records show multiple attempts to establish IFF protocols failed. The A guns were firing against explicit directions for designated corridors." The major placed a heavy, paternal hand on my shoulder. "Tom, save your records for history class. We're in a war of survival. If we admit we shot down 300 of our best men because we couldn't tell the difference between friends and foes, we lose the war right here, in the minds of the men still fighting. This incident is closed. It was a German victory through misdirection." He gave me a hard look that promised disciplinary action if I pushed. I understood the calculation. The cost of admitting such a fundamental flaw in the logistics and command structure was higher than the cost of 300 lives. It was an intellectual defeat far more profound than any tactical loss. I returned to my post. I opened my logbook, turning to a fresh page. I meticulously wrote down the coordinates of the downed C-47s, the frequencies I tried to use, and O'Malley's exact order to fire. I marked the entry with a single word, underscored twice: stigma. The Sicilian tragedy was filed away, covered by propaganda and expediency. But for me, the fear of the enemy had been replaced by a colder, deeper fear, the fear of the overwhelming power of the machine I served. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that this systemic failure would happen again. The math didn't lie. 1 year later, the air smelled different. Not the salt and humid sulfur of Sicily, but the cloying, damp stench of Norman cow fields, mud, and endless rain. The sounds were different too, the high-pitched whine of German 88s, the relentless thud of Allied mortars, and the constant, buzzing drone of Allied air superiority. I had been transferred, quietly, to an observation unit supporting the 29th Infantry Division in the hellish network of bocage near St. Lo. They said my communication skills were needed where clarity was scarce. The truth was, I was a known quantity, a specialist who was too effective to be cashiered, but too dangerous to be trusted with high command secrets. The bocage was the antithesis of Sicily's open beaches. It was a natural fortress, a maze of ancient earthen banks, topped by thick, impenetrable hedges. Visibility was measured in feet, not miles. Every advance was a nightmare of small unit warfare, house-to-house fighting, and constant anxiety. We were winning, slowly, painfully, but the cost was astronomical, measured in shattered nerves and endless attrition. My specialization as an FO was now focused on pinpointing German positions deep within the hedges and coordinating close air support, CAS, from the formidable P-47 Thunderbolts, which we affectionately called Jugheads. The professional stress was worse than Sicily. Back then, the chaos was sudden and spectacular. Here, it was constant, grinding erosion. The map was useless. A position marked as 100 yards ahead could be on the other side of 3 10-foot hedges and 2 minefields. Lines shifted hourly, sometimes minute by minute. Tom, I need 3 rounds, high explosive, on that farmhouse, grid Juliet 4-9. Lieutenant Harris, my replacement CO, barked, his voice hoarse from too much screaming. I scanned the map, my pencil hovering. Harris, that's 20 meters from where Charlie Company reported digging in 4 hours ago. Charlie Company is dead, Tom. I just got a runner. They got ambushed. The Germans are using the house as a mortar spot. Fire now, or we lose Bravo. I inhaled sharply, my mind racing through the trigonometry. The margin of error was terrifyingly small. A short round, a momentary wind shift, an exhausted gunner inputting the wrong elevation, and the friendly fire incident was repeated on a micro scale. Roger, setting M4 charge, deflection 180, elevation January 5th, 58. 3 rounds, fire for effect. My voice was devoid of emotion. I was just the conduit, the calculator. But every time I ordered a strike this close, the image of those falling C-47s flashed behind my eyelids. Every shell, even if it landed perfectly, felt like a dangerous gamble. Micro-incidents of friendly fire were daily occurrences in the bocage. A company of the 4th Division got shelled by their own mortars because they advanced 50 meters too far, too fast, and their radio crapped out. A P-47 pilot, unable to distinguish between the 2 shades of green uniform under the tree canopy, strafed a machine gun nest belonging to the 30th Division. The official response remained the same: attrition, necessary evil, fog of war, enemy misdirection. But the soldiers knew the truth. They knew that when the pressure was high, the American logistical machine was not flawless. It was simply massive, and mass sometimes sacrifices precision for power. My logbook was now filled with meticulous, coded references to these incidents. I no longer wrote full details, just initials and coordinates, a personal, silent tally of self-inflicted wounds. My physical state was deteriorating. Sleep offered no respite. I often woke up sweating, convinced I heard the high-pitched, desperate cry of a C-47 pilot in the static. I was using K-ration coffee mixed with whatever high-proof liquor I could scrounge, German schnapps, usually, to keep the voices quiet. I relied on my hearing now more than ever. I could differentiate the metallic thump of a German mortar from the slightly deeper sound of an American one. I could estimate the trajectory of incoming rounds based on the whistle. This acute sensory input was my shield, but it was also my torture chamber. We were constantly battling communication breakdowns. The sheer volume of radio traffic was overwhelming. The signal corps was doing its best, but the airwaves were choked. Our technical superiority was hitting a wall of sheer usage and bureaucratic overload. I sat one evening, cleaning my field glasses, watching a constant stream of Allied resupply trucks lumbering past, bringing mountains of ammunition. We were firing 3 times the shells the Germans were, maybe 4. Our advantage was undeniable. Yet, every single shell we fired was now tainted by the memory of the night in Sicily. What good is all this power if we can't aim it straight? The atmosphere changed overnight. The word "Cobra" began circulating in the command tents, a massive, coordinated attack designed to finally break out of the bocage and into the open plains. The plan was ambitious, bordering on insane, the largest concentrated Allied air-ground offensive of the campaign. The 8th Air Force would deploy heavy bombers, B-17s and B-24s, to soften the German lines in a tight, narrow corridor directly ahead of the 7 and 8 Corps. My new assignment: work directly with the Forward Air Controllers, FAC, to ensure the safety of the troops on the ground, specifically the 29th and 30th Infantry Divisions, who would lead the break. The scale of the preparation was terrifying. Thousands of tons of bombs. A solid wall of explosions designed to vaporize the enemy. I attended the briefing in a dimly lit damp bunker. The Air Force liaison, a major with immaculate uniform and clear, unbloodshot eyes, spoke of pinpoint bombing and surgical delivery. "We will drop the ordnance parallel to the forward line of troops, FLOT," he explained, gesturing at a massive map taped to the wall. "The designated safe zone is roughly 1,000 yards back from the initial target zone. We're using heavy tonnage, 1,000-pound bombs to ensure total neutralization of the German strongpoints." My internal alarm bells were ringing so loud I almost missed the next sentence. "We'll mark the FLOT with red smoke, but the pilots are instructed to rely solely on predetermined map coordinates. The scale of the bombing run is too vast for last-minute tactical adjustments." I raised my hand. "Major, this map is dated June 10th. The forward line of the 30th Division moved nearly 400 yards forward after the push 3 days ago. If the bombers use these coordinates, they'll hit the 30th Division's reserve battalions." The major gave me a bored look. "Sergeant, the Air Force has the most recent intelligence. We have standardized the coordinates for the flight path based on the most conservative estimate of the FLOT. We can't chase every minor tactical gain. The troops will pull back to the designated safe zone, per the directive. Sir, with the condition of the bocage roads and the saturation of the area, a full division cannot pull back 1,000 yards in the mandated 6 hours. Especially not the support elements and engineers," I pressed. "They will have to manage, Sergeant. The operation cannot wait. Weather window is closing. We move in 48 hours. The major dismissed me with a crisp wave of his hand, his conviction unwavering. He wasn't malicious. He was simply disconnected. His war was fought on clean briefing maps, not in the choking mud of the bocage. I walked out feeling the physical weight of that 400-yard discrepancy. 400 yards was the difference between a successful breakthrough and another mass casualty event. This wasn't fog. This was negligence built on professional arrogance. Over the next 24 hours, I tried everything. I burned the airwaves, sending coded warnings through my divisional contacts. I bypassed the Air Force liaison and reached out to the ground coordinators of the 30th Division, men I respected, men who knew the hell they were in. They confirmed my fears. They were exhausted, pinned down, and could only pull back the forward elements. The support companies, the artillery observation teams, and the command posts were still too far forward. I looked at the map again, tracing the red line the Air Force had drawn. It was a beautiful, mathematically clean line, designed for pilot safety and optimal bomb trajectory. It was utterly divorced from the dirty reality on the ground. It occurred to me that Operation Cobra, in its immense, industrialized power, had become less about defeating the Germans and more about demonstrating American capability. The troops on the ground were simply raw material, necessary to follow the steamroller. If the system is built to move forward, it cannot be stopped by a single man's correct data. I sat with Lieutenant Harris, showing him my calculations. "The first wave of B-17s is scheduled to hit the main road junction here," I pointed. "If they drift even slightly, or if the wind is wrong, the bombs will land right on the 30th Division's tactical headquarters." Harris just stared at the map, his face pale under the stubble. "Tell me the line hasn't moved. Tell me your numbers are wrong, Tom." "The numbers are always right, Lieutenant. The maps are wrong." The worst part was the mandated marking protocol. Troops were ordered to use brightly colored signal panels to mark the exact FLOT for the pilots. These panels, when laid out, clearly showed the forward position. Yet, the bombing coordinates were static, based on the outdated June map. The pilots were ordered to follow the coordinates, not the visual markers, in case the markers were compromised or incorrect. A perfect recipe for disaster. Then came the new intelligence, delivered via tense, hushed dispatch runner. General Leslie J. McNair, the commander of the Army Ground Forces, the highest-ranking U.S. general in the European theater, was arriving to observe the bombing run. Not only that, he would be observing it from an area deemed optimal for visibility, a small, forward rise near the St. Lô-Purriers Road, nestled among the troops of the 30th Division. The stated reason was morale. The general wanted to show the infantry he was willing to stand where they stood, to witness the power that would clear their path. I stared at the grid square. McNair's viewing point was precisely in the danger zone, slightly behind the most exposed support elements, and well within that 400-yard error margin. My exhaustion evaporated, replaced by a cold, searing adrenaline. This was not just a systemic flaw, it was a ticking time bomb aimed at the very top of our command. If the system was going to fail, it was going to fail spectacularly, proving once and for all that our industrial might was blind. I gathered every piece of data, the dated map, my calculations on the 400-yard shift, the official flight path coordinates, and the grid square of McNair's observation post. "Lieutenant, I'm going to the Corps Command Center. I need to get this to someone who can stop this," I said, shoving the papers into my waterproof pouch. Harris grabbed my arm. "You think they don't know? McNair's staff sets his itinerary, Tom. They've seen the map. They rely on the Air Force's precision. Then they don't understand B-17 scatter patterns and crosswinds," I snarled. "I do. And I know what happens when too many bombs are dropped too close. This isn't Sicily. This is concentrated, high-altitude error. They'll erase the general." I left before Harris could stop me. The command center was pure chaos. Tanks rumbling, staff officers shouting, maps being drawn and redrawn. The entire effort was focused on the breakout, not the possibility of self-destruction. I managed to corner a colonel I knew from the 29th Division staff. He was rushing toward a jeep, radio in hand. "Colonel, the bombing zone is misaligned. McNair is in the scatter pattern. We need to shift the northern limit of the corridor immediately." I showed him my maps, pointing to the conflicting data. The colonel squinted, running a weary hand over his face. "Vance, the mission is locked in. The bombers are already over the channel. Changing the flight path now risks collision and total failure of the objective. We trust the Air Force's plan. They've done this 1,000 times in Germany. They've never done this over our own forward lines, Colonel." He handed the maps back. "Your data is noted, Sergeant. We trust the system. Now get back to your observation post and report the German withdrawal." Trust the system. That phrase was the death knell. The faith in American industrial and technical supremacy had become a dogma, a blindness that rendered any contradictory data irrelevant. The machine was too big to be wrong. The hours bled into minutes. It was morning, July 25, 1944. The air was heavy, damp, and the atmosphere felt expectant, like a coiled spring. From my position, I could see the troops of the 30th Division waiting. They were filthy, unshaven, and bone-weary, but there was a flicker of hope in their eyes. They believed that the greatest air force in the world was coming to solve the Bocage problem for them. They were ready to rush the gap once the earth stopped shaking. I listened to the radio chatter. It was a nervous symphony of last-minute checks. "Signal panels deployed. Confirming red smoke ready for launch. General McNair's party is confirmed at observation point M." I checked my calculations one last time. McNair's position was precisely 380 yards south of the planned northern limit of the bomb corridor. Within the scatter pattern, especially given the expected wind shear at 20,000 feet. I tried to raise the 30th Division HQ again, just to warn them personally, to beg them to move McNair's party. The frequency was completely jammed by Air Force commands and navigational checks. I could hear the soldiers' voices over my ground frequency. They were talking about going home, about the massive feast they were promised once they broke out of Normandy. They were young men, clinging to the promise of the inevitable American victory. They didn't know they were about to be erased by the very machine that promised them salvation. I lit a cigarette, my hand shaking violently. The smoke tasted of desperation. I had done everything I could within the rigid protocols of the system, and the system had rejected my warnings in favor of efficiency and adherence to a faulty master plan. The distant sound began. Not the sharp thrum of the C-47s from Sicily, but a deeper, more resonant thrum, like the sound of grinding gears in the sky. Thousands of engines, carrying thousands of tons of high explosives. It was the sound of overwhelming American power arriving on schedule. I looked up, shading my eyes. The first wave was visible, hundreds of silver dots, flying in the immaculate, V-shaped formations that symbolized industrial might and precision. The B-17 flying fortresses. The sheer scale of it hit me again. One man, exhausted and dirty in a hole in the mud, versus the entire operational command of the 8th Air Force, based hundreds of miles away in the cool safety of English airfields. My mind raced back to Sicily. That was a tragedy of panic and small-scale error, a failure of immediate communication. This was different. This was program failure. An error written into the coordinates by a clerk using an outdated map. A flaw magnified by the scale of the operation. We used to mock the German High Command for their rigid adherence to outdated plans, their failure to adapt to reality. But here we were, replicating that exact fatal flaw. Our belief in our own technical superiority had blinded us to the ground truth. We were too fast, too efficient, and too big to correct a small mistake. I realized then that the biggest lie of war is control. We could control the delivery of supplies, the trajectory of a shell, the precise moment a man pulls the trigger. But we could not control the human factors, fatigue, arrogance, and the critical time lag between boots on the ground and pencil on the map. We were about to demonstrate the full, terrifying paradox of modern warfare. The industrial capacity designed to ensure victory was also capable of magnificent, self-destructive blunder. I held my breath, waiting for the first wave to reach the predetermined release point. My fingers tightened on the mic, ready to report the success of the German destruction or the annihilation of our own front line. There was no honor in this. Only logistics. And mathematics. And the mathematics, I knew, pointed directly toward friendly graves. The ground attack began with the sound of the Air Force. Not a series of explosions, but one continuous, overwhelming shockwave. It felt like the earth had been struck by a divine hammer. The first waves of B-17s dropped their loads exactly where they were ordered, just past the designated FLOT on the old map. I was thrown against the side of my foxhole. The sheer force of the concussion sucked the air from my lungs. Dust, dirt, and pulverized hedge filled the sky, blocking out the sun, turning the battlefield into a suffocating gray twilight. The vibrations didn't stop. It was a sustained physical assault. I could hear the roar of the bombs whistling down, a sound that was supposed to promise safety and penetration of the enemy line. "Jesus Christ, they're wiping them out!" Someone screamed nearby, ecstatic with the destructive force. The primary target zone was being hammered into submission. It was total devastation. Then came the second wave, the B-24 Liberators. The formation was slightly less precise, driven by heavy winds at altitude and the desire to avoid the dust cloud generated by the B-17s. I watched, numbly, as a squadron of B-24s drifted. Their trajectory took them slightly southward, directly over the position of the 30th Division's reserve battalions, and heading straight for Observation Point M. I heard the screams immediately in my headphones. Not the sound of German casualties, but the familiar, chilling sound of American fear. "Incoming! South! They're hitting the command posts!" Jesus, they're dropping white phos. It's us. It's the Air Force. The voice was raw, breaking down into hysterical sobs. The bombs landed, not on the main German line, but on the rear elements of the 30th Division. Explosions ripped through the rear supply roads, hit entrenched vehicles, and scattered through the headquarters compounds. The dust cloud intensified, now mixed with the acrid, sickening smell of burning aviation fuel and, worse, the sweet, metallic tang of fresh blood. I grabbed the mic, trying to break through the Air Force command channel, knowing it was useless. FO advance to Air Command. You are hitting friendly troops. North Corridor is compromised. Correct fire, over. Static. The Air Force was deafened by its own efficiency. The mission was executing flawlessly according to their paperwork. I could still hear the frantic ground calls. Men were scrambling, trying to understand why they were being attacked by their own side. The terror was compounded by confusion. They had been promised salvation from above, not death. Where's the general? Where's McNair? We need medic support on him. Everything's gone. The CP is gone. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The 400-yard error. The wind shear. The rigid adherence to the old map. The coordinates were followed perfectly, and in doing so, they obliterated the highest concentration of American personnel in the immediate area. The noise of the bombardment continued for minutes, relentless and total. The very landscape was being reshaped by the friendly explosives. Then, finally, the last wave of bombers passed. The silence that followed the bombs was profound and terrifying. It wasn't the silence of exhaustion, but the silence of extinction. Smoke and dust hung over the battlefield. The forward troops, shell-shocked but alive, began slowly, hesitantly moving forward into the pulverized zone. They had been spared the initial blow, but the cost was visible behind them. I directed a runner toward the 30th Division HQ, telling him to report what I had heard. Then, I listened closely to the command channels, waiting for the inevitable emergency report, the frantic demand for rescue. Nothing. The reports filtering through were confused, focusing only on the successful breakout achieved by the 7 Corps further south. The losses in the north were being categorized as intense pre-assault artillery concentration. Finally, a choked, quiet voice came over the 30th Division tactical channel. Op-M is non-functional. Personnel loss confirmed 100%. Unidentified fragments. We are proceeding with the advance. I didn't need further confirmation. General Leslie McNair, the man in charge of the entire U.S. ground effort, had been killed by his own bombs, vaporized by the very air power he had come to observe. The irony was not subtle, it was grotesque. In a war fought on the principle of technical supremacy, we had achieved a level of lethality so advanced it could kill its own high command while aiming for the enemy. If we cannot protect our generals from our own might, how can we protect the men in the dirt? I felt an overwhelming detachment. I had predicted this. I had quantified the error. I had warned the system. And the system had responded by proving me right, yet still succeeding in its ultimate goal, the breakthrough. The lives lost were merely necessary, disposable input for the vast mathematical equation of victory. The ensuing days were a blur of coordinated deception. The success of Operation Cobra was undeniable. The German line was shattered. We had achieved the breakout. Patton's tanks were pouring through the gap. The war was turning decisively. The investigation into the losses, particularly the death of General McNair, was immediate, intense, and utterly compromised. I was pulled in by a major from Army Intelligence, a man whose uniform looked tailored and whose hands had never held a shovel. Sergeant Vance, your records show you raised concerns regarding the FLOT and the accuracy of the bombing corridor, the major stated, not as an accusation, but as a technical point. Yes, sir. I estimate the error at 380 to 450 yards south of the planned limit, directly impacting 30th Division's positions and observation point M. The official report indicates that high winds at altitude caused an unavoidable scatter pattern and that enemy flak may have forced some bombers to release early. I leaned forward. Sir, I observed the drop. The B-24s were slightly off azimuth. The release was synchronized, not forced by flak. The fundamental error was the use of outdated map coordinates, which I reported. The major fixed me with a cold stare. Sergeant, General McNair was killed in action. This is the official statement. We are fighting a total war. The success of Cobra is paramount. To undermine the operation by focusing on what you call a systemic failure is to give aid and comfort to the enemy. He tapped my log book, which I had been ordered to surrender. Your professionalism is exemplary, Vance, but your loyalty must be absolute. The enemy does not need to know that we are capable of such errors. The psychological effect on our remaining divisions would be catastrophic. This incident must remain the fog of war, a necessary cost of doing business. He offered me a transfer to the Zone of Interior, a cushy desk job in Washington, away from the front. A medal recommendation was mentioned. The price, permanent, complete silence. If I take the transfer, sir, does this mean the maps will be corrected for the next operation? I asked. He hesitated slightly. The process will be reviewed, Sergeant. But we cannot stop the momentum. We cannot pause the war for bureaucracy. I declined the desk job. The idea of sitting in safety, knowing this institutional blindness would continue, was worse than the smell of cordite. I was not court-martialed, but I was quietly neutralized. I was transferred far behind the lines, assigned to monitor obscure, low-priority signals traffic. My job became meaningless, a form of professional exile. My access to critical command frequencies and high-level mapping data was permanently restricted. I spent my days staring at the static, the white noise a constant reminder of the voices I had heard in Sicily, and the screams from Operation Cobra. My hands developed a persistent tremor. I couldn't hold a pen steady, let alone input precise fire coordinates. I was broken not by German artillery, but by the weight of American precision. I realized the true terror of the modern war machine. It didn't care about individuals, not even its generals. It demanded smooth, efficient operation, and any glitch, any soldier who noticed the discrepancy between the plan and the reality, was simply shunted aside. The great myth of the American military machine, its logistical and technological infallibility, had been shattered for me. The machine was not infallible. It was merely too large to fail, and too vast to apologize. The death of McNair, the paratroopers in the sea, they were not casualties of the war against the Axis. They were casualties of the war against fatigue, haste, and the institutional dogma that scale guarantees success. I kept my logbook. It was now thin and worn, smelling faintly of blood and oil. It was my only truth. I hid it in the lining of my duffel bag, a testament to the fact that the enemy did not always wear gray. I saw the war through to its end, pushing paper and monitoring dead frequencies. When the news of victory in Europe came, the celebrations were wild, but I felt nothing. We had won. The American machine had ground down the enemy through sheer, overwhelming force. But the memory of the friendly fire incidents prevented me from celebrating a clean victory. I saw the casualties of Cobra and Sicily as a dark ledger kept by fate, balancing out our technical advantage. Years later, I struggled to reintegrate into civilian life. The sounds of a passing truck, a loud car backfire, any sudden noise sent me spiraling back to the night of the C-47s or the deafening blast of the B-24s. I was professionally ruined. My mathematical precision, once my greatest asset, had made me a liability. I could no longer trust the numbers, because I had seen how easily human error, compounded by immense industrial scale, could turn flawless calculations into tragedy. I never spoke publicly about the friendly fire incidents. The code of silence imposed by the major had been effective. Who would believe a former sergeant over the official history? The history books spoke of Operation Cobra as a masterstroke of combined arms. They spoke of McNair as a general who died bravely at the front lines. They never spoke of the fatal 400-yard error. They never spoke of the panicked gunners on the Sicilian beaches. I now live in a quiet, isolated place, far from cities. I spend my days tending a small garden, where the only sounds are the predictable rhythms of nature. Sometimes, late at night, when the world is utterly silent, I take out my old log book. The ink is faded, the paper brittle, but the coordinates are still there. The cold, hard numbers that define human failure. The last entry in that book is simple, written years after the war, in shaky handwriting. If you cannot control the chaos controls you. Friendly fire is not an accident. It is the inevitable byproduct of a machine that values speed and volume over precision and humanity. It is the cost of systemic blindness. When you are fighting an enemy, you accept the risks. But when the weapon aimed at the enemy curves back and strikes you, the trust is broken forever. I survived the war, but the war never left me. It resides in the persistent ringing in my ears, a low, mechanical hum, eternally reminding me of the sound of my own side shells, whistling down on my own men. That is the residual sound of true, systemic defeat. The sound of American industrial might, perfectly aimed, but perfectly wrong.